The metallic groan of the docking clamps echoed through the chamber as the human delegation stepped into the alien vessel. Every movement felt scrutinized under the cold white lights that poured down from overhead panels, stark against the shadows clinging to the walls. The air smelled faintly of ozone and metal, sterile and unnatural, like a place that was alive but unwilling to welcome its guests. At the rear of the delegation, just behind the nervous diplomats, a woman adjusted the strap of her utility vest and fell into place. No one paid her much attention. To them, she was only the translator, useful when the guttural alien tongue twisted itself into incomprehensible noise. Her name was Celine, though even that detail was rarely spoken. She kept her expression neutral, her gaze downcast just enough to suggest subservience, though her eyes missed nothing. The aliens stood in two rigid rows, their bodies elongated and armor-like, their black eyes unblinking. Their movements carried the precision of trained soldiers, and when they shifted in unison the sound was more mechanical than organic. The human diplomats shuffled uneasily at the sight, whispering reassurances to themselves, but Celine noticed how the aliens' attention didn't linger on the delegates. It lingered on her. The lead diplomat, a man who valued his polished smile more than his trembling hands, cleared his throat and began the formal greeting. His words stumbled out, rehearsed but brittle, and Celine translated them with practiced fluency. Her voice carried across the chamber, low and steady, weaving human uncertainty into alien syntax that turned sharp and clear in her mouth. The aliens tilted their heads in unison, listening not to the envoy who spoke, but to the woman who gave his words shape. The alien commander stepped forward, taller than the rest, his elongated skull gleaming in the sterile light. His voice was a guttural growl layered with clicks, the kind of sound that made human ears instinctively recoil. Celine didn't flinch. She translated evenly, her tone carrying the weight of his warning. The humans had trespassed too many times. Their requests were thin veils over arrogance, and patience had nearly run its course. The diplomats bristled, trying to respond with empty promises, and she repeated their platitudes with the same controlled cadence. Inside, she measured every syllable from both sides, storing it, dissecting it, interpreting more than just words. The negotiation unfolded with a delicate, brittle tension. The humans pressed for concessions, dangling false gestures of peace. The aliens remained stone-like, their voices quiet thunder rolling beneath their stillness. Celine's presence went unnoticed by the very people she worked for. They treated her as a tool, a mouthpiece, a necessary inconvenience in their posturing. Yet the aliens' eyes returned to her again and again, as if they saw not a tool but something else, something waiting to be acknowledged. When the second envoy grew bold, his voice rising with misguided confidence, Celine caught the faintest twitch ripple through the alien ranks. A shift in posture, almost imperceptible, but one she recognized instantly. They were soldiers, disciplined to the last detail, yet their stillness trembled when a particular inflection passed her lips. She adjusted her tone, disguised it as translation, and watched the ripple subside as if soothed. The diplomat noticed nothing. None of them did. For a fleeting moment, Celine allowed herself to study the commander directly. His eyes, dark as polished stone, locked on hers. In that silence, a message unspoken passed between them. Recognition. She shifted her gaze away before it became too obvious, returning to her careful mask of indifference. The humans might think her invisible, but invisibility was precisely what made her indispensable. The hours crawled with exchanges that went nowhere. Demands repeated. Promises recycled. Frustration mounting. Celine's voice alone remained steady, weaving the fragile bridge between sides that did not trust one another. But beneath the surface of her translations ran another current, quiet and unseen, the weight of choices unspoken, commands waiting for their moment. She knew she was not here to preserve peace. Her role was misnamed, her title a deliberate misdirection. A translator, yes, but of far more than language. By the time the session was adjourned, tension hung in the air like a blade suspended by a thread. The humans whispered among themselves, congratulating each other on progress that did not exist. They filed out, shoulders stiff with false pride, leaving Celine to linger a moment longer. The alien commander did not move as she passed. His soldiers stood motionless in their ranks, yet she felt their eyes follow her with the sharp focus of weapons waiting for a signal. Celine did not look back. Her face remained composed, unreadable, but within her the shape of the conflict was already forming. They thought her presence was incidental, that her purpose ended when the words ended. Soon they would understand how wrong they were. Soon, she would decide whether the next translation would be diplomacy or the first command of war. The return to the alien vessel the following day carried an edge sharper than the first. The diplomats walked with forced composure, but their eyes betrayed sleepless nights and whispered doubts. Celine followed as she had before, a silent shadow carrying no visible authority, her role unchanged in their minds. To them she was merely the bridge for words, an accessory necessary to endure this strange dialogue. They did not see the subtle way she surveyed the corridors, marking exits and the rhythm of the patrols, nor the faint nod she gave when an alien guard's gaze lingered on her a fraction too long, as though awaiting silent permission to breathe. The conference chamber was colder now, the lighting harsher, casting the humans in a pallid, fragile glow. The alien commander stood in the same position, flanked by soldiers whose stillness seemed more like coiled anticipation than discipline. The session began with pleasantries, strained and hollow, and Celine's voice once again bridged the distance. But beneath the surface of her translations the air trembled with something else, the steady unraveling of the human's illusion of control. One envoy, a man eager to prove himself indispensable, pushed forward aggressively. He accused the aliens of dishonesty, his words sharp with condescension, blind to the widening stillness that followed. Celine translated faithfully, yet with each guttural syllable she delivered in the alien tongue, the atmosphere darkened. The commander's eyes fixed on her, not on the envoy, as though weighing her against the insult. For a moment she considered softening the man's words, but she let them pass unaltered. She needed the diplomats to believe they were steering this ship into safe waters even as it drifted toward the rocks. A murmur ran through the alien soldiers, subtle, but to Celine it was unmistakable, a ripple of discontent suppressed beneath rigid training. She adjusted her stance, squared her shoulders, and delivered the next sentence with a tone so controlled it seemed carved from stone. At once the ranks stilled, as though her presence alone had imposed order. None of the humans noticed. They were too busy congratulating themselves for what they mistook as dominance. The hours ground forward, each exchange harsher than the last. Celine's mind worked in layers, the spoken words, the unspoken intent, and the constant evaluation of the forces shifting around her. She remembered her training not as fragmented memories, but as muscled deep truths. Long nights in dim rooms filled with static-laden transmissions, coded commands hidden in language, the weight of obedience pressed into her spine until she carried it as naturally as breath. She had learned to kill with silence, to lead with a whisper. They had given her the guise of a translator because it was the perfect camouflage. Overlooked, underestimated, forgotten, until the moment came. That moment edged closer. The commander leaned forward at last, his voice rumbling low, the alien words thick with contempt. Celine translated. The patience of his people was at its limit. The next human mistake would not be tolerated, and no envoy would leave the ship alive if they continued to treat warriors as supplicants. The diplomats bristled at the threat, arguing over each other to draft a retort, but Celine heard what they did not. The commander's tone was not a warning, it was a test. His gaze locked on her again, waiting, searching for acknowledgement. She gave none, only continued her careful translation. But the silence between words grew heavier, and the envoys grew desperate. They whispered frantic instructions into her ear, telling her to manipulate, to soften, to twist, as if she were nothing but a tool they could wield clumsily. She obeyed outwardly, yet her choices in tone betrayed a different truth. Each phrase carried an undercurrent that steadied the alien ranks, subtle cues that reinforced discipline. Without realizing it, The diplomats spoke into the shape of an army already aligned to her cadence. It was the youngest envoy who snapped first, his arrogance outweighing caution. He slammed his fist on the table and spat words of accusation, declaring the aliens liars and warmongers, his tone shrill with fear disguised as courage. The chamber froze. Even the air seemed to halt. Celine translated his words exactly, her voice calm, deliberate, leaving no margin for ambiguity. The commander rose to his full height, a towering silhouette etched in light and shadow, and his soldiers shifted with a collective precision that made the diplomats recoil in terror. In that instant, the facade cracked. The humans saw death staring back at them, and for the first time they turned not to their speeches, not to each other, but to the woman they had ignored. The translator. Their eyes pleaded with her, desperate for rescue, as though she had ever been theirs to command. Celine felt the weight of their fear pressing down on her, but her face remained unreadable, her heartbeat steady. The commander spoke again, words slow and deliberate, his voice carrying the inevitability of judgment. Celine did not immediately translate. She let the silence stretch, let the humans squirm in the knowledge that their fate now depended on the woman they had dismissed as invisible. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted, lower, sharper, edged with a precision that stilled even the alien soldiers. The translation was brief. The time for negotiation has ended. The envoys recoiled, panic flaring across their faces. They demanded clarification, demanded she soften the message, demanded she save them. But she did not. She stood poised, her expression calm, her voice carrying weight it had never carried before in their presence. The aliens were no longer staring at the diplomats. They were staring at her, awaiting direction. For a single heartbeat, silence ruled the chamber. Then Celine exhaled softly, and the air itself seemed to shift around her. The facade of the translator was crumbling. They were beginning to see her for what she truly was, though not yet fully. That revelation would come with the next breath, the next command, the moment when she chose no longer to translate, but to decide. The envoys, pale and trembling, still clung to the belief that she was theirs to use. The aliens, silent and unwavering, already knew otherwise. Celine stood at the knife's edge of truth, and both sides waited for her to tilt the balance. The chamber was silent except for the faint hum of the vessel's systems, a mechanical rhythm that underscored the stillness of every figure present. Celine stood between two worlds, the trembling envoys behind her and the disciplined alien ranks before her, their weapons half-raised, awaiting a single word. Her mask as a translator had already thinned beyond repair. The diplomats saw it now in the way the soldiers ignored their cries, in the way the commander's gaze never shifted from her, in the way her silence had more authority than their shouts. The lead envoy, sweat beading on his brow, clutched her arm with a desperation stripped of dignity. "Tell them it was a mistake," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Calm them, fix this." His hand trembled against her sleeve, and she felt the weight of his ignorance pressing on her like a parasite. She turned her head slowly, her expression level, and spoke not to him but to the commander. Her words were fluid, crisp, and absolute in the alien tongue. At once the soldiers straightened, forming lines of readiness, their movements sharp and unquestioning. The envoys gasped, finally understanding. Their translator was not pleading for them, she was commanding their executioners. Fear cracked their composure into jagged shards. One of them stumbled back, muttering denial, while another dropped to his knees, begging her in frantic whispers. Celine neither answered nor acknowledged. She stepped forward, her boots striking against the metallic floor with measured precision, closing the space between herself and the alien commander. He bowed his head, not deeply, but enough to mark recognition of authority. The gesture was subtle, yet devastating to the envoys, who recoiled as though the sight alone confirmed their doom. Celine's lips moved, delivering a phrase that carried no translation this time. The words were an order, not for human ears, but for soldiers bred to obey. The response was immediate, weapons powered to life, glowing edges humming with energy. The chamber became a tableau of inevitability. The lead envoy found his voice at last, shouting her name as though invoking it could tether her to them. "Celine, you serve us. Remember who you are." His desperation made him blind. He did not see that the name he clung to was a shell, a mask crafted for his convenience. She turned her gaze on him then, cold and unyielding, and for the first time, he understood there was nothing in her eyes that tied her to his cause. "You never saw me," she said softly, her voice almost gentle in its finality. "You never listened." The alien commander raised his weapon at her signal. Panic erupted. One envoy lunged toward the exit, only to be cut down by a precise strike that left the air thick with scorched ozone. Another tried to plead even as soldiers closed in, their movements efficient and merciless. The chamber rang with the echoes of collapsing bodies, the human cries swallowed by the mechanical hum that never wavered. Celine did not flinch. She stood still, every breath measured, every sound etched into her memory not as horror, but as confirmation. These men had believed themselves negotiators of peace, architects of compromise, but to her they were pawns already marked for removal. Her role had never been to bridge their words, but to decide their worth, and they had proven themselves unworthy. When the final body fell, silence returned. The soldiers held their formation, awaiting further command, their loyalty fixed entirely on her. Celine stepped toward the center of the chamber and lifted her chin. The commander approached, lowering his weapon, his posture deferential. In the alien tongue, he addressed her not as an outsider, but as a superior, acknowledging her place above even his own. The weight of the moment settled over her, heavy yet familiar, as though she had been walking toward it all along. Her gaze swept across the chamber, past the still forms of the envoys, past the watchful eyes of soldiers. "This is only the beginning," she said, her words calm, almost contemplative. "They thought me a voice for their ambitions. Instead, I am the echo of their end." The soldiers bowed their heads in perfect unison, the sound of their movement a single whisper of allegiance. The commander gestured toward the corridor, awaiting her next directive. She allowed herself one final glance at the fallen envoys. There was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction, only the clarity of inevitability fulfilled. She turned away, her footsteps carrying her into the shadows of the vessel, where the war she had been shaping in silence waited to be spoken into existence. Behind her, the chamber remained still, the air heavy with the truth that had revealed itself too late. The humans had thought they brought a translator to guide them through alien words, never realizing she was the architect of their destruction. And as she disappeared deeper into the vessel's labyrinth, her figure swallowed by the cold light, it became clear that this was not the end of her story, but its first true chapter.